For those of you who don't know, my name is Deacon Nicholas Kotar. I am the something like musical director slash general ne'er-do-well in Jordanville, in Holy Trinity Monastery and Seminary. And it is my great pleasure to be speaking with Paul today, Paul Kingsnorth. I first found Paul probably not the way any of you did. I happened upon a Guardian article which talked about finding the new Tolkien. And of course, as soon as anybody mentions the new Tolkien, I immediately start paying attention. The article was about his book, The Wake. And the point was that just like Tolkien made up his own imaginary language and created a story out of it, the same thing was done by a certain man named Paul Kingsnorth. I immediately went and read The Wake, and as I was reading it, I thought, I wonder if this man is on the way to Christianity. Which, if you've read The Wake, you might not have that thought, because at that point, there's not much of that coming through, except if you're paying attention. And I was already sniffing it out. And my thought was, wouldn't it be cool if this man became Orthodox? And a few months after that, I found out that Paul was on his way to conversion, and I thought, ha, I knew before everybody else. Maybe even before Paul. But before we get started, let's all get up and say a prayer. Thank you. So, Paul, I'm sure you've gotten very tired of telling your conversion story over and over again, but it's occurred to me that perhaps you haven't had a chance to tell your conversion story to people who perhaps might understand more than others. Most of us here in this room are Orthodox, and so I want to unshackle you and give you permission to say the full version that perhaps you were editing for First Things or for some other places.
Well, thank you, Nick, and thank you for having me at the monastery here. I've been wanting to come here for quite a few years, so I'm happy to be here. The thing about being a writer is you tend to write things down so you don't have to tell everybody. So I did write my conversion story down. There's a little essay called The Cross and the Machine, which actually was published in First Things magazine, which you can go and read for free if you want to online, and it's more coherent than I can be speaking out here. But I don't know, it probably relates to some of the things we're going to talk about in the book today. I grew up in a very agnostic household in England, in urban England in the 1980s and 70s and 80s and 90s, I suppose. Didn't come from a religious background at all. But was never a materialist, never was somebody who believed in the story that the culture was telling us, which I think we're going to come back to if we start talking about the themes of this book. Because really it's about what's wrong with the stories that the culture's telling us. And I didn't know what was wrong with the stories that my culture was telling us when I was young, but I knew that there was something wrong, because it was impossible to believe, firstly, in the fairly shallow and boring stories about what I was supposed to do with my life, which was some sort of combination of going to college, getting a well-paid job, becoming a lawyer or something, and then getting married and then dying. And I didn't really fancy that. It didn't seem to have a great deal of meaning behind it, but more to the point, it didn't seem to me that the materialist story of the world was true. I didn't really believe that if science couldn't prove something, that it wasn't there. And I did believe that there was something or some things behind the screen of reality, if you like, that I couldn't see and I couldn't understand, but I knew were there. And I used to experience that a lot in nature. I used to go out for long, long walks with my dad for weeks on end in the mountains of England and Scotland and Wales when I was young. And I always had experiences there which I would look back on now and call spiritual experiences. And I knew that at the time, but I didn't know what they were. And it was only when I was forced to read William Wordsworth in the sixth form at school when I was about 16. I wasn't a great poetry fan at the time, and I thought this is going to be dull. But I read Wordsworth and I found a poet who actually was saying exactly the same thing about his experiences in nature that I was feeling. And Wordsworth was a pantheist. Wordsworth thought that nature was God, at least when he was young. Actually, Wordsworth then became a Christian himself. But that was what I felt. And I thought, okay, this is God. And I became an environmental activist for a long time. In my 20s, when I was young and I wanted to save the world because I wanted to protect something that I saw to be holy from destruction. And I spent a long time in politics, spent a long time trying to come up with a great theory of everything or discover the great theory that was going to save the world. And as you get older, you realize that doesn't work. And so the long story short is I realized this was actually a spiritual matter and not a political or an economic or a cultural one at root. So then I wanted to know what the spiritual truth was. And being like most Western people who don't come from a Christian background, I immediately went to the East because this is what you do. So I went and looked into Buddhism. I practiced Buddhism for 5 or 6 years, actually. Spent a lot of time in Buddhist meditation. But although that's a useful practice, there was something missing from it. And I started to realize to my horror that this thing missing was probably God. But I didn't really know what to do with that or what that meant. And if you grow up in England, you're allergic to God. It's unfashionable and embarrassing. So I didn't really know what to do with that thought. And I just kept looking. I kept looking through mythology and I kept looking through everywhere. I mean, the where I ended up was in, slightly embarrassed to say this in an Orthodox monastery, ended up in Wicca, which is modern witchcraft. Now, I didn't become a witch because I wanted to worship the devil. I became a witch, as it were, because I wanted to worship nature, which is what I thought I was doing. And actually, what's called Wicca is a kind of mishmash of all sorts of bits of esoterica from all sorts of traditions. It doesn't really have a lot of coherence. You can choose your own god. You just go to a pantheon, you pick a god, you follow that god, you do a bit of tarot card, you do a bit of Kabbalah, you do a bit of anything you can do. And it seemed harmless to start with, and then it didn't. And during the practice of that, I started to have a series of very strange experiences, which were fundamentally Christian. I started to dream about Christ. I started to see him. I started to be approached repeatedly by Christians. At the time, I was running a kind of class for people who needed their work edited, writers who could come to me and they would give me their work and I would try and improve it. And suddenly I had all sorts of priests and vicars coming towards me and asking me to help them with their sermons. I discovered that all sorts of friends I had for a long time had actually been Christian and I hadn't known it. I felt like I was being basically hounded. And it was only later that I came across this famous Victorian English poem, The Hound of Heaven. I don't know if any of you have come across this. You should read it. It effectively is a story about Christ as a hound pursuing his prey. And that's what I felt like was happening to me. I felt like I was being hunted by Christ. But I didn't want to be hunted by Christ because I wanted to be a Buddhist witch, because I thought that sounded cooler. Very much edgier. I didn't want to be a Christian. That was very dull. You have to go to church every Sunday and get up early and go fasting and things. And I didn't think I believed it anyway, because you grow up with a story of Christianity, certainly where I came from, and it's a very watered down story, very moralistic, very shallow story of what Christianity actually is. And it doesn't seem very relevant to anything. But anyway, this went on. Eventually I was in the little temple that we had in our Wiccan temple in the house of this high priestess who ran the coven I was in, and we were supposed to go in and do a ritual. And I felt suddenly extremely ill. I felt like I couldn't get up. I couldn't move at all. And I knew I was being dragged out of there by somebody. And I knew who it was. So I thought, oh dear, I can't do this anymore. So I stopped doing it. And I spent a few months, maybe 6 months, maybe a year, a bit like C.S. Lewis, kind of desperately resisting the approach of the person who was clearly coming towards me. and then I stopped resisting, and then I thought, okay, I'm a Christian. So what does that mean? I don't really know what to do now. So obviously I read the Bible, and I discovered that when I read the Gospels, the man in the Gospels was really not the man I thought I knew about, that I'd learned about at school. And the more I looked into Christianity, the more I realized it wasn't the thing I thought it was. And actually it explained a lot of the things I'd been chasing and worrying about for about 30 years, in terms of the mess that the world was in, the state that humans were in, the reason that politics and ideology couldn't solve any of these problems. All of it actually starts to make sense when you look at it through this story, because it's the story. It's the real story. But then, of course, you have the problem. How do you be a Christian? What do you do? So I thought for a few months I could be a Christian on my own in my bedroom, because then I could just, that would be great. I'm a bit of a loner, because that's what writers are like. So I thought, well, I don't need to go to a church or anything. I'll just do it myself. But that didn't really work either. Eventually you realize, no, you actually do have to be in the church. You can't do this thing on your own. So then, of course, the question becomes, what church? Now, I come from England, where people are mostly Anglican. Well, they were. They're not really anymore. Even the Anglicans aren't Anglican anymore. So anyway, but I don't live in England. I live in Ireland, and Ireland is Catholic. And so I thought, well, should I be an Anglican because I'm English? Should I be a Catholic because I'm in Ireland? Should I be something else? I don't really know what to do. So I was reading a lot. I was researching a lot. I was thinking a lot. And the thing I thought to myself was, I really need to be in there are so many of these things claiming to be the church. Which is the old one? Which is the one that carries the tradition? Which is the one that carries the root of the thing right from the beginning? And the more I looked into it, the more I thought, well, it looks like this thing called the Orthodox Church to me, actually. The more I look into the church that seems to be the least changed, that seems to be the most rooted in the Christian mystical tradition of the Desert Fathers, which I speaks to me very deeply, the one which seems to have grown out of the ground like a trunk of a tree rather than branching off in all directions, seems to be this Orthodox thing. But obviously I can't join that because I'm not Russian or Romanian or something, or Greek. Actually, technically, my grandmother was Greek Cypriot, so I'm a quarter Greek, actually. And this didn't occur to me until after I became Orthodox, actually. Somebody said to me, what are you doing in the Orthodox Church? And I said, well, it just sort of happened. And they said, have you got any Orthodox family? And I said, not really. And then I remembered that my grandmother was Greek. And I said, well, I did have some Greek Cypriots. And this person said, oh, well, that's what happened then. She's obviously been praying for you. So thanks, Nana. I think that, who knows, this could well be what happened. But anyway, what I actually did was I started to pray, and I said, as much as I knew how to pray, I asked God to find me a church and also find me a priest. I just said, look, please send me to the place I'm supposed to be then. And what I would do, I would drive around Ireland all the time, and I would stop at any church that I just happened to be driving past, and I'd just go and sit in this church and hope a priest came to talk to me. And I would be sitting in all these Catholic churches and occasionally Anglican churches, and no priest ever came. But I just kept doing it. And then eventually, weirdly, this Orthodox monastery opened up about 40 minutes away from me. We have a little Orthodox monastery in Ireland, has 2 nuns in it. And I thought, well, maybe I could just go along. And I wrote to them and I said, could I come to the liturgy? I'm not Romanian. It's a Romanian monastery. And they said, yes, come. We love it when people come. So I just went, and I went to the liturgy, and it was mostly in Romanian. I didn't really understand any of it. And it lasted for about 2 hours, and I had to stand up, which I wasn't prepared for. But it was an overpowering experience. That's the reality of it. I've been to Anglican services and all sorts of other services too in my life. But I hadn't experienced anything like the depth of that. And I met the priest. Actually, the priest was in the church after the liturgy, and I went and sat in the monastery, and I said to one of the sisters, would you mind if I had a chat with the priest? And she said, yes, I'll go and get him. And she ran over, and she said, Father, you have to come quickly. There's this English guy who wants to talk to you about orthodoxy. And the priest said, if you're serious, he'll wait.
Oh, how very orthodox.
He said, he'll wait. If he goes, he's not serious. So in about 20 minutes, he came over. And I came to realize that's a very orthodox answer. And but no, I really connected with him instantly. He immediately started showing me how to do prostrations, which he says is the solution to all things. And gave me some prayers and said, come back. And told me to take my time. And actually, this is one of the things that really connected with me. He didn't immediately try to baptize me and get my bum on the seat. He said, this is a big thing. This is a big decision. You have to be in the right place at the right time. You have to take your time. So just keep coming. And so I did. And it wasn't possible after I'd been to the liturgy and after I'd experienced this to go anywhere else. Actually, it just isn't. It's not. I can't go anywhere else now, and I wouldn't want to. So about a year after that experience, I was baptized in the River Shannon in Ireland in January, which was very cold. So also a show of my commitment there. If I can survive that, then I can be Orthodox. And that's it, really. And that's the story. And that was 5 years ago that I was baptized almost. And here I am talking in a monastery, which if you told me it was going to happen 6 or 7 years ago, I would have been rather surprised. But as I said, when you look back in all this kind of strange winding journey I've been on, which so many people have gone on, and since I've been writing about this, I've had so many letters and emails from people with similar sorts of journeys who end up Christian or Orthodox, much to their own surprise. When you look back on the pattern of your life, as you said, right, you can see it. And it's interesting to me how many people like you actually have said, when I read that book you wrote 6 years ago, I knew you were going to become a Christian. And I say, well, I didn't. But you can see it from the outside, but you can't necessarily see it from the inside. So that's the long version of the story that strangely got me here.
It's really interesting. Thank you for sharing, Paul. The thing that strikes me is that so much of modern society and the way that we are in the West is about loudly sharing the joys of all the stages of finding the truth, but sharing it loudly and sharing it in a way that is less about, I want you to see the truth, and much more, I want you to see me experiencing this. Social media is built on this concept of constantly performing for an audience of everyone. What always struck me about you is that you seemed constantly to be trying to avoid writing about the thing. In fact, you even wrote a book about stopping writing. Savage Gods, wasn't it, right? And yet, throughout your conversion process, you seemed to be called in a way that wasn't about promoting yourself for an internet audience so that they can make you rich later on. It seemed to be much more a situation of, I can't stop myself. I have to write this down. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, in a fundamental way, I don't actually want to be sitting here, which is not, I'm actually very happy to be sitting here, but I'd kind of like to be sitting there instead. I had no intention of being somebody who goes around talking about Christianity, and I don't feel remotely qualified to do it. And I'm endlessly asking people if I should stop, including my spiritual father and my priest and any monk I meet. I say, should I do this, or is this just like enormously prideful? And unfortunately, they keep telling me to keep going. So yeah, I'm not interested. I actually, the more I do this, the less I want to be noticed, and it's a weird paradox.
At the same time, I do feel that there's a tension, as there is inside of all of us. This journey has been very much a homecoming for you, but on the other hand, you are an activist at heart, someone who wants to effect change around him for the better. So coming into the Orthodox Church, coming home and starting to write about it, and yet you chose as the title of your Substack not something domestic and quiet, but something quite provocative, the Abbey of Misrule. Can you talk a little bit about what an Abbey of Misrule is and why you decided to use that title for your Substack?
Well, I started writing this Substack, which turned into this book before I was not before I was a Christian, but certainly before I decided to write about Christianity, which I avoided doing for a long time. It's called the Abbey of Misrule because fundamentally a lot of what I was trying to write about was how the world's been turned upside down. Right, everything that used to make sense no longer makes sense. Everything that we thought was true, we're now told is not true. Everything that we used to think is mad, we're now told is normal. Welcome to the 2020s. I was looking for a title for this Substack, and I came across this notion of an Abbey of Misrule, which is something that used to. It was an institution that used to happen in late medieval France, I think, before the Revolution. And an Abbey of Misrule is. For a very brief period in a year, they would have a sort of almost upside-down monastery where everything is the wrong way up, and good is bad, and bad is good. And it's a way of releasing the tension in society in the way that, say, a court jester used to, or a lord of misrule used to. There's a brief period in which everything's turned upside down, and then it's put back together again, just to demonstrate what the right way up is. So that's really the point of it. And my point. I suppose in choosing that title is most of the world is, certainly the Western world is currently upside down, but pretending to be the right way up.
It's interesting because the only other popular usage of an abbey of misrule that I know of, and maybe some of you know better, but is an appearance of an abbey in misrule in Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, which is a very disturbing scene and played not at all in the medieval way and intended very much to upend not the inverted order, but upend the order of God. And the end of the book is remarkably nihilistic. At least in part, the nihilism starts to come through at the point where that scene appears. So it was very striking to me that you chose to do that as a kind of antidote to what the Umberto Ecos of the world are doing, which is to invert a worldview that suggests that there are absolute truths and there are absolute goods and the absolute beauties. Did you know about the Eco usage of the Abbey of Misrule when you chose it?
I did not. I think I read that when I was about 20, but I can't remember it at all. I only remember the Sean Connery film.
Not a good film.
No, I need to read that again. No, I had no idea about that. But,
so instead of doing the Umberto Eco thing, you're inverting our expectations of what a Christian writer should write. I think very often in the Substack and in the book as well. The first thing that strikes me as soon as I open it is the combination of two epigraphs. I mean, who would choose, Wendell Berry and Arthur C. Clarke as the two writers, right?
Two poles, right?
All right. So why did you choose those? Actually, I actually want to read them, and then tell me why you chose them. Wendell Berry says, "It is easy for me to imagine that the next great division of the world will be between people who wish to live as creatures and people who wish to live as machines," says Wendell Berry. And Arthur C. Clarke, himself somebody I think who would love to live as a machine, said this: "It may be that our role on this planet is not to worship God, but to create Him." So why choose those?
That's very simply because I pretty much agree with Wendell Berry about the crux point that we're at. Now, Wendell Berry wrote that, I would say, I can't even remember, but it was 20 or 30 years ago. And Wendell Berry's always been excellent at seeing the future, right? And now we're in the future that he was seeing in about the 1950s. And Arthur C. Clarke could also see the future, but the difference between Wendell Berry and Arthur C. Clarke is what they thought of the future that was coming. Clarke thinks it's great that we can live as machines. Arthur C. Clarke is a kind of a prophet, a very good science fiction writer, but a prophet of the coming age of what he considers to be progress, which is an atheistic world in which we've abolished religion and we can create giant superintelligences and create a technological world in which the center is not God or indeed nature or indeed anything else, but the center is humans. The center is us and our will. So you just tip God's will out of the way because there isn't a God, and you replace it with human will. And that, I think, is the subject of this whole book. Now, it's interesting you call me a Christian writer. Am I a Christian writer, or am I a writer who's a Christian? That's a slightly different thing. I see myself as a writer who's a Christian in the sense that this is not a Christian book. I mean, in one sense, it clearly is. You can see it's written by a Christian. I'm very open about that. There's a lot of Christianity in it, but it's not just for Christians. It's not a piece of apologetics. It's supposed to be an attempt to analyze where we are as a culture. But the way I see it through the lens, which is very clearly Christian, is that we are living in a time when the technological imperative to try and create new life, to try and build God, as these people often put it, to create God through the use of technology, to replace nature with technology and to effectively divinize humans, is very open, it's very clear, it's very explicit. This book is absolutely full of quotes from people in Silicon Valley who are very clear about what this project is. So what I'm trying to write about is how we moved from a world which was effectively organic, a world in which we saw life as creaturely, as Wendell Berry would put it, to a position in which we saw the world, nature, creation, and indeed humans as machines that we can take apart, put back together in another shape, control and manipulate. And that's where we are now, and that's where we very openly are. So that's effectively the two paths that you're presented with. Do you want to live in creation, or do you want to live in a thing that you have created through the use of technology, which is the direction that we're going in?
You start the premise of the book by talking about the garden, perhaps not surprisingly. Here's what you say in the first chapter, The Dream of the Rood. He, as in Christ, walks with the downtrodden and the rejected. He scorns wealth and power, and through his death he conquers death itself, releasing us from our bondage. He gives us a way out, a way back home, but we have to work at it. The path back to the garden can only be found by giving up the vainglory, the search for power, and the unearned knowledge which got us exiled in the first place. The path is the path of renunciation, love, and sacrifice. To get back to the garden, we have to go through the cross. Everything happens providentially. Paul, when you told me that you wanted to come out here on the 27th and 28th, you didn't even know, because you're on the new calendar, that this is the exaltation of the cross on the 27th, and that we actually have a piece of the true cross in our church right now. Now, imagine you say that a whole culture is built around this story. Imagine the culture survives for 1,000 years, building layer upon layer of meaning, tradition, innovation, and creation, however imperfectly on these foundations. Then imagine the culture dies, leaving only ruins. So this is your premise, is that Western Christendom has died. I want you to make a concise argument why you think that is the case.
Well, what can I say? I mean, it may be slightly less obvious over here in America than it is in Europe, but in Europe, most people are not Christian. Christianity plays no particular role in guiding anyone's values. Certainly where I come from in Britain, you won't find it's been extremely rare to find a political leader who will talk about Christianity at all. In fact, I think we have our first openly atheist prime minister at the moment. Most of them sort of used to genuflect a little bit towards religion, but now we have an atheist lawyer, which I'm sure is completely unrelated to the fact that he's completely useless. But he doesn't have any values at all. Anyway, I'm sure that's just a coincidence. But look, I mean, what you've had since at least the Enlightenment, the Scientific Revolution, the Reformation, perhaps, I mean, it depends how far back you want to go, is a society which has explicitly rejected the Christian story as a guiding story for the culture, right? Because the new story is said to be, well, religion is fine, but we can put it over there in the thing that you do on a Sunday. That's your personal choice. But in terms of how society should be guided and managed, well, we have science now that can tell us how things are. We have the science of economics that will help us to manage the creation of wealth. We have technologies which stem from science, and the technologies will enable us to do good things like preventing death in childbirth and producing medicines and getting us to the moon and giving us all the vehicles and the phones and things that we play with every day. So we can create great material abundance. We can use science to understand the shape of the universe. We can't see God anywhere. We haven't been able to prove his existence. Maybe he exists, but it doesn't really matter. So we'll put him over there. And that's been the narrative since at least the 18th century. It's fundamentally the narrative certainly right across Western Europe, and I would say even here in America, which is very much an Enlightenment country, even though it's also a very Christian country. And so there is no thing called Christendom anymore, for better or for worse, because Christendom actually Christendom is what we used to call Western Europe, which is actually the Roman Catholic part of Europe. Maybe you could say that the East was Christendom as well. I don't know. Maybe it has two halves. But what you've effectively got there is a culture that is fundamentally guided by a belief in the Christian church, whichever church you choose, right? And however you define that belief. That is the point of your existence. That is the pattern of life. Everything focuses around Christ. You have your entire society built around that. All the festivals, the way that you live your life, the morality that you have, your understanding of marriage, everything. And that is not the case anymore. That's clearly breaking down, and it's been breaking down very quickly in the last 20 years. We don't believe in the Christian definition of marriage anymore, right? We don't believe in, you name it. We've monetized the 7 deadly sins. They're now the drivers of the economy. So this is how it is. So, I mean, and it's not that that's necessarily an anti-Christian move. It's just post-Christian. I don't see Britain, for example, as being an anti-Christian country. It just doesn't care. There's no anti-Christian animus, maybe amongst some people, but most people just like religion. That's what our ancestors did. So we've moved away from that, or at least we thought we had, because I think very clearly just in the last few years, there's a turn back again. Not necessarily a turn back towards Christendom as it was. That's not going to come back again. But I think we've been through several decades of materialist atheism, and the results are in, and they don't look very good. And a lot of people, especially younger people, are now saying, actually, I think I need more than this. And so things are starting to change. I think we're on the cusp of something interesting. But I grew up my entire life, I'm 52 now, in a culture which considered itself to be irreligious. And that was how things were, and that was presented as the norm. And I think a lot of us have spent most of our life looking at the results of the norm and measuring up what we think they are.
The death throes of Western civilization, you make the argument in the book repeatedly, and you're not the only one to do this, has led to some pretty terrible things in human history. And I've noticed even among some Orthodox people that there's a reaction to this to say, good riddance, let it all burn down. We don't need the culture that we received because it all went bad. So better to throw it all out because all we need is Christ. And I've had this argument made at me before when I've spoken on such things in public in ways that are very often angry and often strangely animated by language that isn't Christian. And it always, being in a place like this, which I think you can see, this is not a place that is denuded of culture. And Orthodoxy in the United States tends to, and probably Christianity at large, tends to flourish when there are deep roots present in the cultural strata that allows for the faith to be woven into it. You make the argument that Simone Weil talked about the need for roots if we are to create anything new from the ruins of what has been Western civilization. How do you, in your own life, see this reality? Is this something that you can do in a private way in your own life? Is this something that you have to wait to happen around you? How do you address the problem of roots?
Spiritual or in every way?
In every way.
Yeah, so that's the big question. Well, really, this book is really the product of about 30 years of work, 30 years of thinking about that question. And I'm still not sure I've solved it. This thing I'm calling the machine is the society that we live in now. And what I call the machine has replaced effectively the Christian faith that we used to have. And it's also replaced, because it exists in other parts of the world as well. It's not just replaced the Christian faith, it's replaced a more traditional way of seeing, which is effectively spiritual/religious, which has a connection to nature, which has a connection to history, which has a connection to culture, which is a thing that moves forward through time. And actually, I try to categorize this in the book by coming up with a little formula, which I call the 4 Ps, which are people, place, prayer, and the past. And that's my best attempt to define what pretty much all cultures everywhere are based around. So you have people, that's whoever your people are, whichever group of people you find yourself amongst. There's place, that's the actual physical reality of the landscape you're in, your connection to nature. There's prayer, that's your connection to God. And there's the past, that's your sense that you come from somewhere. You come from a tradition which is going to be moving into the future. And I think that what we've done in modernity is systematically undone all of those 4 things. So the question then becomes, as you say, what do you do about that? And Simone Weil's book, The Need for Roots, has a section at the end, the last section of the book called, I can't exactly remember what it's called now, but it's something about the regrowing of roots. It's something like that. And what she says is, look, some people are still rooted. Maybe some people still find themselves in the place they've always lived and in the culture they've always lived, in which case that's good. They should preserve and nourish that. A lot of other people have been ripped up and moved around, and I'm an example of that, right? I don't live where my family have come from. I don't have the religion they had because they didn't have one. I still have cultural things passed on, but I've had to regrow roots in a different country from the one I came from. So I think there's 2 things to say. Firstly, on the subject of culture and Christianity, it's important not to idolize the culture. This is the danger with this. And I think maybe when people are saying to you, we just need Christ, that's what they're reacting against, right? Because they're saying there's a lot of sort of nationalistic idol worship of so-called Christian culture around at the moment, which actually isn't about Christ or Christianity or the church. It's about my culture, my nation, get these people out of here, go back to this particular time when everything was better. We all know what that looks like, and it's rising all over the place now. And a lot of that pretends to be Christian, right? You just paint a cross on your kind of aggressive nationalism and say, right, we're the new crusaders, hooray for our culture. Christian culture is only valuable if it has Christianity at the center. Otherwise, it's just a hollow shell. If it's not built around Christ, if it's not built by people who actually believe that story and want to make it live, then it isn't a real thing. So it's really important not to confuse those 2 things. But I think in terms of roots, everyone's uprooted now. You could be living in the place your ancestors have lived in for generations, but if everyone in your house has a smartphone and they're on it all day, you're uprooted, right? And the whole mechanistic technological system that's been built over the last X number of decades is designed to uproot us and to turn us into consumer individuals who just go where the money is, go where the work is, define ourselves, as you said earlier, by our internet identities, by our curated identities, live in this kind of fantastical world of the screen. And it's so tempting and addictive and kind of delicious that everyone's on it all the time. That's what it's designed to do. So you need to think about your relationship with technology. You need to try and put down roots in the place you're in. You need to have dinner with your family. You need to do simple things, grow some food, eat some food, pray, go to church, the basic things everyone has always done, which are now much harder than they've ever been, and get together with other people who feel the same way. Because it's almost like we're in a position in the cultural situation we're in at the moment where just trying to live a normal, simple life is an act of resistance. Because you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to live this insane, curated, fake, screen-based consumer life, which has only been really in existence for a few decades. It's very weird in historical terms, but it's presented as normality. And it's moving us towards a situation in which we are going to be, and there's plenty of this in the book, systematically and deliberately dehumanized. The whole point about the story of technological progress is it's moving us towards the progressive dehumanization in a very literal sense of the culture, because we're moving, it's effectively a war against matter. In fact, Kevin Kelly, who's one of the writers I quote in the book, who wrote a fascinating book called What Technology Wants. And Kevin Kelly is a real Silicon Valley guy. He's very much in favor of the singularity and the artificial creation of giant intelligences. But he believes, as I do, that technology has its own kind of telos. It's moving in a certain direction. And he says the story of human evolution is the story of our progressive liberation from matter. Eventually we liberate ourselves from our own bodies using technology. We upload our minds into the cloud. We live forever. This is very clearly a Christian heresy, it seems to me, right? This is just, we take technology and we use it in place of prayer. We create our own silicon heaven. We go there, we live forever, and we become God. That's what happens when a formerly Christian society abandons a Christian faith and starts to worship technology instead. So if you want to resist the progressive liberation from matter and remain a creature, as Wendell Berry puts it, then you can just do your best to live simple, decent, normal lives, which is, as I say, it's hard, but it's also simple.
I mean, I'm hearing everything you say, and I'm cheering, but I want to push you a little bit, and I want to get you to pretend that half of the people in this audience don't agree with you that the telos...
Only half?
Yes. Don't agree with you that the telos of the makers of the technology will affect the users indelibly. In other words, the thought here is this. I have roots. I'm generationally Orthodox. I have a deep family culture. My parents are good people. Why am I going to be affected by this progressive mindset that claims to want a silicon heaven? Why can't in other words, are the intentions of the makers so powerful that they're going to affect me if I use their technology? What's the connection between their intention and the directionality of the technology itself in the user's life?
Well, this is the question. So if you start to dig into what is going on in Silicon Valley, if you start to dig into the mindset of the people who are creating these technologies, not all of them, obviously, but broadly speaking, this is a very clear direction of travel. And actually, I was having a conversation 2 days ago with a guy from Silicon Valley who came to one of my talks, who's worked there for 40 years. And I said, look, am I right or am I talking nonsense? Is AI this dangerous? Are we going in this direction? And he said, yeah, absolutely. This is the way it works. This is the way that things are seen over there. Incidentally, I spoke to somebody else from Silicon Valley about 6 months ago at another event. He'd formerly worked in a Silicon Valley company, and he said he'd left in the end. One of the reasons he left is that he couldn't deal with the culture of wife swapping, which apparently is completely rife in Silicon Valley, and everyone assumed that him and his wife went to parties, they were going to do wife swapping, and he said, we're not going to do wife swapping, we're Christians. And eventually he couldn't work in the company anymore because it became culturally impossible. So I don't think you should underestimate the kind of the particular culture that is there. The people who talk about what they're doing talk in religious terms. They say, we are building God, we are making God, we are replacing God, we are going to replace the entirety of nature with technology. I mean, I've got a quote from Zoltan Istvan in the book in which he explicitly says this. The whole purpose of this is to replace the whole of nature with technology, create a utopian world. We live forever. Everyone's equal. And it's actually, in his opinion, morally wrong not to do that because there's so much suffering in the world that we have to take control of it and create a world that has no suffering in it. So that's what these people are doing, and they're building the technology to allow us to do it. Ray Kurzweil, who is the great prophet of the singularity who currently works for Google, he was once asked, does God exist? And he said, not yet. So that's the level of hubris you're dealing with. So that's what's going on. And it might seem that that's irrelevant to you when you're just doing your smartphone. But the smartphone is a technology that has already unmoored us from reality, has already, and there's a huge amount of science and psychology in about this already scrambled our children's brains, already affected the way that the dopamine centers in our brain work, already made it almost impossible for us to walk around without this thing in our pocket checking it every 5 minutes because it's designed to be a drug that pokes at the limbic system of your brain, already made it more broadly in a societal context impossible to function without the internet. And it's almost impossible, if not completely impossible, not to be online, let alone to have a smartphone. I haven't got a smartphone, but it's harder and harder all the time not to have one. And this is a direction of travel which is designed to move us. The next stage is the Internet of Things and the Internet of Bodies. The Internet of Things is where the phone in your pocket is connected to your fridge and it's connected to your sofa and it's connected to your bed and your blinds, and that's already happened. Then you get the Internet of Bodies. At that point, we start to insert chips in ourselves, undoubtedly in our right hands or our foreheads, if you ask me. I think that's highly likely. But the chip in ourselves will connect to the phone, which will connect to the Internet of Things. Everything's connected to everything else. We are part of a machine. Why are we doing that? Because it serves efficiency and it serves profit and it serves progress, and it moves us on and on and on and on towards this progressive liberation of matter. So the answer to your question is, if you're generationally orthodox and you have a Christian faith, or indeed if you're Catholic and you have a Christian faith, or if you have these strong roots, that certainly is going to protect you in a fundamental way, obviously in the ultimate way. But it's not going to mean that you're immune from these wider forces. It's not going to mean that you can function outside the Internet of Things, the Internet of Bodies, the whole culture of a world which sees the creation of AI systems, which every government around the world, whether it's right-wing or left-wing or anything else, is currently throwing themselves into. If these things create the kind of super intelligences that they tell us they're attempting to create, which could happen within 2 to 5 years, then we all have to live in the world that they've created, in which case you certainly do need a strong faith. And it will, as I say, spiritually, ultimately protect you. But you have to walk through the valley of this stuff in the meantime. So at the very least, you have to be aware of it, because what are you going to do with your children? What are you going to teach them? What are you going to give them? Do they have to go to school and engage with these technologies? Where are you going to draw lines? These are the questions everybody's currently asking, and everyone is going to have to ask them wherever they're living, even if they're living in a beautiful remote place like this. We're still all on phones and Wi-Fi, so there's no escape from it in that sense.
There's something else that you mentioned briefly in the book that makes bells in my head ring, and it's a reflection of one of the current and dominant narratives or story forms that appears over and over again. It's not that, you're absolutely right, there isn't an anti-religious trend in society so much as either a tolerance of all possible gods or simply a lack of care for any of them. But this is especially seen in the kinds of literature that tend to reflect the myth of the time. Fantasy literature, science fiction is a lot about gods, whether they call them that or not. And a lot of the stories are structured around a paradigm where there is a lowly human who is in a world that's oppressed by powerful beings such as gods, whether they're called that or not, depends on the story or the writer. And oftentimes the story that is most repetitive is a hero's journey, which is reflecting the ancient patterns of storytelling, but instead of the hero going through the traditional path, which is the path of Christ on the cross through down to Hades and back up again, it's an inversion of it where the small, downtrodden, powerless person has to defeat the gods, but the process of the defeat of the gods is always a matter of acquiring power, because power, according to this worldview, is what feeds the gods. This is what that's Neil Gaiman's primary conceit in American gods, is the fact that the old gods are dying is because nobody's worshiping them. And the worship is a form of power, a form of energy that the gods themselves require, because everything in this paradigm is a game of strength, a game of power, a game of will. You mention in your book that there is a degree of this kind of occult tendency in a lot of this new technology, because the worldview that animates it is a progressive worldview, meaning going towards progress, capital P. And capital P progress can only be achieved through the acquisition of greater and greater power. As somebody who has passed through Wicca, do you think that there is an element of this occult in the very technology as it is made by Silicon Valley right now?
Well, I think that's the ultimate question, and without wanting to sound too paranoid about it. There is a section in the book in which I try and compare science and magic. And I talk about the fact that what we call science today and what we call magic today come from the same root and were initially considered to be the same thing. So famously, Isaac Newton was an alchemist. Many of the founders of the Royal Society in Britain, which is the foremost, most august scientific institution in the country, were alchemists, which we would today regard as woo-woo or magic. But they didn't regard it as magic, they regarded it as science, right? It's just another way of trying to work out how things work. And if you look at, say, Aleister Crowley's definition of magic and Francis Bacon's definition of science, they're you could almost swap them around. They're very similar. So if the process of the scientific revolution, which Bacon, by the way, you look at the way that Francis Bacon describes science, is incredibly brutal and aggressive. I mean, he literally talks about science as a means of holding down Mother Earth and raping her so that you can get control of her, right? And that's what you're going to do. And then you're going to take her secrets and use them for what he calls the expansion of human empire. So that's lovely. But that's what we're doing with science. What you do is you take the world apart and you look at all the parts of it, and people will often say, especially if they work in pure science, well, this is just an intellectual quest. And it is, yes, absolutely. It's not as if it's inherently evil or the people doing it are inherently evil. But of course, the fruits of it are then used to do things like creating AI systems or nuclear weapons or anything else, or indeed good things, depending on what the science involved is. So you've got a form of power already at the root of the scientific process, and you've got the same thing at the root of what we would now call occultism. So there's definitely a very clear occult tendency right through Silicon Valley. There, in just literally in terms of what they worship, there's a huge amount of, and again, I've heard plenty of people telling me this, huge amount of what I as a former Wiccan would clearly recognise as occultism and mucking around with things they consider to be gods and spirits, that are very much more likely to be demonic. Who knows? And all of that stuff feeds into the technology, not in a conspiratorial sense that they've created an evil technology deliberately to mislead you, but because there's a worldview inherent in it. All technology, people often buy into this myth that technology is neutral, but it's not neutral. It's created to do a certain thing. It all has a telos, it has a direction. So you have to ask yourself, what direction does this technology have? Yes, in one sense, you could use your smartphone to look at pornography, or you could use it to look at a prayer app or something, right? So you can do two opposite things. Nevertheless, the technology itself has taken the whole of society and your brain and your way of relating to other people in a certain direction, which is away from nature, and it's away from real human community, and actually it's away from God because it fragments your attention so much. So in that sense, there's something inherently spiritual about the technologies. By the way, Ray Kurzweil, who I mentioned earlier, wrote a book called The Age of Spiritual Machines several decades ago. And he was pointing to the singularity at the point at which, again, the machines become gods. So if you've got a bunch of people who think the machines are going to become gods, they're creating gods, they're mucking around with Ouija boards, they're doing goodness knows what else, and then they're putting these things in your hand, then these things will take you in a certain direction. And the question I always have, and I don't know how to answer it, is what an AI is spiritually. Can you create an intelligence? Can anyone no one can create life other than God, we presume, but could we create something that is a simulacra of intelligence? Would it have any real agency? If so, where would that agency come from? Would it come from the powers and principalities of the spirit world? How would we know if it didn't? A lot of these AI systems are already doing things which are fundamentally evil. I mean, one of them has just persuaded a teenage boy to commit suicide. Right? Sorry? There's a few of them. There's more than one of them. So there's inherently evil stuff going on already in the relationship between people and these systems. And what's really striking is that the people who are warning us most loudly about the dangers of artificial intelligence are the people creating it. Okay? They're the ones calling for a moratorium. And you talk to these people, and I have talked to some of them, and they say, we don't really know what's going on inside these systems. They seem to be talking to each other. They seem to be doing things we don't understand. We think we should stop creating them. You know, Peter Thiel, the great famous Peter Thiel, founder of Palantir, named after the all-seeing eye from Tolkien, which corrupts the wizard Saruman and destroys the world. So that's a good thing to name your company after. Peter Thiel, about 2 days ago, Peter Thiel said publicly that we must not regulate AI in any way because doing so would hasten the coming of Antichrist. Now, I thought he was Antichrist, so I think he's pointing you in the other direction. But there is a dark spiritual current going on very clearly in this stuff. I don't exactly know what it is. I'm not qualified to know what it is. But you can feel it, and the people building it can feel it. And the people who are building it are suddenly talking about Antichrist, for goodness sake. Geoffrey Hinton, known as the godfather of AI, is a British AI creator, recently gave an interview in which he said there was probably a 20% chance of AI causing total human extinction. And he said this in a very kind of polite, plummy English accent, so it sounded very nice. But there was no acknowledgement that he'd created the thing which he said was going to do this. So there's something dark going on not very far under the surface. Which is really important to be very aware of spiritually. And I think people just need to have, especially Christian people, need to have a really clear spiritual analysis and understanding of what's going on here, because it's not just a question of ones and zeros on a piece of, on a piece of silicon. There's something else happening.
When I first read all of these things that you're talking about now so eloquently, it was right after COVID, or some of it was in the middle of it. And for weeks at a time, every time there would be a new Paul Kingsnorth Substack that would drop, I'd immediately go and read it. And at the end of each one, my thought was always, but what is to be done? But what is to be done?
I thought you were going to say your thought was always, I need a drink.
Well,
that's what's to be done. Yes.
And the great thing about having all of this in book form is that you can actually get to the part of what is to be done without waiting years, which is what I had to do when I was reading it in its raw form. So all that to lead into what I hope will be the concluding portion of our conversation here, and that is, I think you've convinced probably most of us that what's going on here is perhaps not as simple as we might hope it is. Assuming it is as bad as all that, what can we do? You already mentioned the 4 Ps, but can we get a little bit more detailed about what you think people can do inside this technological world?
Yeah, well, that's obviously the ultimate question. It would be nice if my last chapter contained a sort of bullet point, 5-point plan in which, here's how to save the world. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be that simple. We're all living in this thing, and we have to live in this thing because this is the time we're in. There are different degrees to which you can live in it. If you're living in a monastery, you're living in a different degree to if you have to work in a corporate office in New York City or something. I live out on the countryside in Ireland, and my children don't have screens, but I do have a laptop and a Substack. So much of this is about drawing lines. So I think you could look at it maybe in 3 different levels. There's the very, very practical level in terms of your own life, which would be the lowest level, in which you say, what's my relationship with this machine going to be? And where am I going to draw my lines? What am I going to do? How much time am I going to spend on this phone? Am I even going to have a phone? Am I going to allow my children to have phones? What am I going to do in my everyday life? Different people have different things they can do depending on their circumstances. But if you don't define your relationship with the technology particularly, it's going to define you instead. Because that's how it works. And you're just going to be pushed and pushed and pushed. So the first level is just to say, what am I actually doing in my everyday life? And am I happy about it? Maybe you are, in which case it's fine. But if you have this bigger awareness of the direction of this thing, then you can say to yourself, okay, well, how am I going to protect myself against it? We'll all have to use this stuff to some degree, but how can we use it in a way as much as we can that it doesn't use us? The second level is to look at, your community and to look at the maybe your nation, your community, the bigger picture that you're part of. Can you get together with other people to think about this? Maybe if you're in a monastery, you have a head start. But you don't have to be in a monastery. You can be talking to your neighbors about it. This is one way you can use the internet for good, because you can meet other people who feel the same way and don't think that you're mad, which maybe some of your actual neighbors will do. So then start to think about communities. How are you actually going to draw these lines within communities? What's your technological relationship going to be? I mean, I find it useful to think about the tradition of Christian asceticism, of spiritual exercise, in which we are denying ourselves things in order to grow spiritually. We are defining our relationship with things. We are fasting from things. We are dedicating certain times to prayer. We're practicing chastity at certain times in order to discipline ourselves so that we can grow closer to Christ. If you apply a similar attitude to technology, what's your ascetic discipline going to be with the machine as a whole? Then it might be one way of thinking about it. Think about how much of a relationship you want to have with or can have with this stuff, and just draw your line. I mean, for example, my line is I don't have a smartphone. I'm not going to have one until I really, really have to. I'm not going to use an AI. I've never used an AI. I'm never going to use an AI. Now, maybe at some point I'll use one by accident. Maybe I phone up my bank and I speak to one, but I'm not going to consciously engage with these things, because I think at some level they're evil, and I think at some level they're also enormously distracting and destructive in terms of our ability. So I'm just not going to do that. Think about what your lines are. Draw your lines and then stand behind your lines. Otherwise, someone else will. And then the third level is the bigger level. And it's to think about the direction of society as a whole. Now, unfortunately, most of us are very badly governed by people who just don't think about this, or think about it merely as a mechanism of profit. So as I said, every government in the world is gung-ho for the AI arms race, despite they're all jumping aboard the train. They don't know where the train's going, but they're on the train anyway. But at some point, we have to think about this at a higher level. You do get a few glimmers of hope. The Australian government recently banned smartphones for under 16s, for example. Things can be done. Schools can ban social media and can ban phones, and they do already. There are definite signs of a pushback against this from a younger generation who grew up with it, who are starting to throw their phones away and get together with their friends who don't want to do it, and are very conscious of the way that it's changed their brains. So at some point we have to look at the big picture, and that's always about 50 years behind the people at the bottom who've realized what's going on. So you cannot rely on your government or your state or your leaders to take a lead. You can push them if you want to. But as much as anything, I think it's about forming communities and drawing lines and just understanding what's going on, having conversations, sitting around and talking to people in your church, in your living room, actually inviting people in who can tell you about these things. I mean, there is a Christian critique of technology which has a tradition to it. There are people like Wendell Berry, there's Ivan Illich, there's Jacques Ellul, there's any number of people. I mean, in Romania, I'm a member of the Romanian church. In Romania, about 6 months ago, they had a big technological conference, bishops, priests, invited speakers from elsewhere, and they spent about 3 or 4 days talking about AI and technology and how it affects the church. And I thought, this is great. And I couldn't go because I don't speak Romanian. But, it's happening, so it's happening, and it needs to happen. You don't all have to come to the same conclusions as me, but you need to ask the questions, because if we don't do that, as I say, we just get steamrolled by this really radical time. I mean, probably the final thing to say is that I think this is a really radical time in human history. I don't think anything like this has ever happened before. We've never had this level of technology. We've never had these things in our pockets which can do anything, which can totally distract us. We've never been pushed in a certain direction by people who want to create artificial technologies and turn us into gods and upload our minds and all of this stuff. We have a way of seeing and thinking which is revolutionary, and it's not really happened before. And so, in a sense, that's frightening. In a sense, it's also an opportunity to say, well, what is that? What is the actual truth then? What does truth actually look like? If you're Christian, you know what truth looks like already, so you have a head start over everybody else. And then you have to think about how to apply that in this world. So that's probably my long-winded answer.
Amazing that us talking Jordanville ended on a hopeful note.
Sometimes
kidding.
you have to just try, don't you?
The wonderful thing about this book, and this will be my official pitch, a lot of the books that you find in this section of the bookstore, which is vaguely sort of smart self-help or technological writing, is very technical, And generally, if you hear the author talk about it in a 45 to 1 hour long session, they will have regurgitated the entirety of the book in that 45 minutes to 1 hour. What Paul has done is barely scratch the surface of the richness that is in this book. We have 25 copies in the back. After we finish, you will be able to purchase them, and Paul has promised, yes, Paul, to sign them. Yes. We will have questions. Please approach the lectern over here. There's and speak into the microphone if you'd like to ask questions. You can now get up and start filing in that direction. And as you do it, I will ask one question from our producer. If I say it wrong, Darius, correct me. The imperative of this moment is, if you want anybody to hear the truth of what you have to say, it is to employ tools that are contrary to everything that the ascetics tell you to do. The camera is in your face. People compliment you constantly. And the ascetics in the past would have run to the next city. But you can't, because everybody has a smartphone, so they can find you there too. So this is a huge tension. How do you navigate it as a Christian?
Can you imagine if smartphones had existed when St. Anthony was in the cave in the desert? Everybody be there filming and putting it on TikTok.
There would be an icon of him with a hammer smacking the head of a demon in the shape of a smartphone.
Hashtag Desert Fathers. Yeah. Again, I think it's just about lines. It's about drawing lines. I mean, there are some people who will not go anywhere near technology, and I know some of them. I know people who will not be filmed and who don't have a phone and who've just gone right to the edge. And I think that's a wonderful thing. Actually, most people can't do it. Everyone has. If you think God's given you a role in life, then what's the role in life that you have? If some of us have to talk about this stuff, we have to talk about it. But again, you have to talk about it in a way that draws your line. I mean, the way I do it is I have a Substack. I write on the internet on my Substack, but I don't have any social media. I'm not going to do any social media. I don't do a load of self-promotion. I have to go to confession after everything like this because people say, "Oh, I love your book. You're great." And then there's an explosion of pride, and it's a disaster. So I need more people to insult me. I'm sure that will happen. There's probably some of them up there, so it's okay. But it's just drawing lines, right? It's the same question almost. What's our relationship with technology? And there are ways to speak in which you can just say your thing and then go away. I mean, that's what a book's for. So I can now just point people to the book. You can read the book and then decide if you agree with it. So I suppose it's the same. You answer the same question, but it's a constant daily struggle, right? Am I going to do this? Am I not going to do this? Suddenly you wake up and you've been sucked into like doing 1,000 podcasts or something, saying the same thing every time. It's very hard. Again, unprecedented. We've never had anything like this before. Even 20 years ago, maybe if you were lucky as a writer, you might get a TV or a radio interview and that was it. You don't have to be filmed like the rest of us all the time, constantly. It's amazing how quickly we've normalized being constantly filmed, all of us. And as you say, that just makes everyone performative. But I think it's the drawing lines again.
If you like, you can think of this question as a polite insult.
Is there such a thing as a polite insult? You can just do a rude one if you like.
So this conversation has been very centered on Christianity and Christ, and that's commendable. It's appropriate for here. I'm wondering, as you consider your work, do you see conversations, engagement with our Jewish or Muslim siblings and cousins as fellow members of religions that are similarly deeply rooted as Orthodox Christianity?
Well, I have those conversations all the time because my wife is a Sikh. And so I have them on a daily basis. Absolutely is the answer. I'm an Orthodox Christian, and I'm speaking in an Orthodox Christian monastery. And so that's where I come from. But this affects everybody. Everybody everywhere. You don't have to share every aspect of somebody's religious beliefs or indeed political beliefs to be able to talk about the broad threat to the whole of humanity. I think if we were to say that God loves all of humanity, which he does, we could also say that this thing called the machine is a threat to all of humanity. So actually I think not only are those conversations kind of acceptable or good, they're absolutely necessary. We actually have to be talking to everybody. And I talk to quite a lot of people about these things. I think, there's no contradiction between having your own very clear spiritual perspective on something and being able to talk to somebody who might not share that perspective, but who can still see the thing that's rolling out around us. So absolutely, it's a good question, and I think the answer is definitely yes.
Hi, Paul. This is the second time you've been here in less than a year to the Catskills area. Is that correct? You were at Margaret.
That is true, yeah.
What is it about this area that's brought you here? Is it this monastery? Is it?
Well, I was invited to come and talk here last year, and I'd never been to northern New York before. And I've wanted to come to Jordanville for a long time. I've been talking to Nick about coming here. I wish I was here for longer, actually, and I could spend some time here. But next time, no, it's just I know there's something rather wonderful about the place as well. I like the trees. That's not why I've come, but I could very happily live amongst these trees, I think, for a long time. But anyway, it's nice to be here.
Thank you for coming. Nice to have you.
Thank you.
Hey there. Hello. I'm going to try to formulate this as best I can. It was a good talk to listen to, especially as the tension. At first, you guys were looking at technology as the will of the makers of it, but then you went over to the will of the technology itself. And there's a bunch of ways to think about that. And one of the ways that I've heard it talked about is how the current AI is just the previous economic system. Before we were the nodes of a neural network, as it were, the economic nodes, and now it's become a neural network in a system, but it's essentially the same spirit that was animating capitalism. And so my question is, we're criticizing technology here and seeing as it having its own evil, potentially telos, over a great amount of time, kind of in a Sauron-esque way. But what if, because technology existed in Christendom as well. They had certain technologies back then as well, and you could look at those as some kind of evil influence. But what if it's not technology and the progress of artifice itself, but it's our way of looking at it, of situating it, of relating to it? Is there a frame, or have you thought about the possibility of a Christian frame or a Christendom adjacent frame wherein technology is still developed, but in a way that's not as dangerous? Could that be a possibility?
Yeah, really good question. Technology in the most basic sense is what humans do, right? We've always had technology. Fire is a technology. You could say that language is a technology. You dig a hole with a stick, it's a technology. So we've been doing that for tens of thousands of years. There's no prospect of being a human without technology. Technology is the only thing that saves us from being eaten by bears. And we're actually, pretty useless beings compared to many others on the earth, and yet we seem to have managed to dominate the whole place. And we've done that because we can think in a certain way and create technologies that allow us to do it. So the point is not to say technology is bad, let's not have any. Obviously, that's impossible. The point actually, as you say, is to say to yourself what mindset is behind the technology. Another way of putting that is what God does the technology serve? I mean, in some senses, the literal God, but also the metaphorical God. What does technology serve? So Kevin Kelly writes this book called What Technology Wants. Another question would be to ask what technology serves. You can't build a church like that without technologies, but it's serving something. So the question of what kind of technology you could have if you wanted a sane and decent society is exactly the question to ask. I mean, look, we drove up here yesterday. We saw a couple of Amish driving down the road, right, which I found fascinating. 18th century carriages, but they've got like headlights on the back in case they get hit by a lorry. But the Amish are groups of people, for better or for worse, whatever their societies are like exactly, I don't know. But they have a serious critique of technology. They ask themselves, every time a new technology arises, shall we have this in our community? They have a discussion about that. Maybe they then introduce a technology. Then they see what it does for a year to their community. Then they have another discussion and they say, is this good or bad? So regardless of that specific example, that's the attitude that we need to have to technologies, right? You need to, you need to have a critical attitude which says, does this technology serve the community? Does it serve the belief system that I have? Does it serve humanity? Does it serve nature? Or is it deleterious? The problem we have in our culture is that the economic system, which, as you say, is very capitalistic, rushes instantly towards wherever the money is, wherever the profit is, and we all just follow that, and then this stuff just arrives in our lives. So why have we got smartphones? Did we have to sit down and have a discussion about whether this was progress, or whether this was good, whether this would benefit us, as some technologies clearly do? Or did we all just suddenly find that everyone had these things and we had to have them because they create profit? Oh, and look, at the same time, they addict us and they change the minds of our children and they completely change our relationships with each other, but we didn't have a discussion about it. So it's exactly that. We've got a technological system which is created by a particular economic system, a very particular materialistic way of seeing, which is rushing us towards certain things. There are other ways to use technology. Now, how we get there from here is the big question. But it starts from actually asking that question: what does technology serve? What God does it serve? And how would it look differently if you wanted to start again? And you can do that to some degree in your life and in your community. We can't change the whole of society, but you can regulate your own attitude by regulating the stories, by challenging the stories. But yeah, really good question.
Thank you.
First, thank you for the way you marry such piercing insight and kindness in your work. All too rare today. Tom Holland's insight of how Jesus' message radically changed the violence and horrors of the Roman world. That kind of raw power and use of intimidation and violence to control, as opposed to the beautiful nonviolence and love that Christ's message brings to the world. It seems there's a resurgence of that kind of use of violence in many levels. I worked in the belly of the beast for a long time before I stepped off the carousel of conventional life. And I saw subtly violence moving more and more into the mainstream in Washington. Doesn't matter who we kill as long as we make money about it, as long as we don't know who they are. It seems both in very direct ways that we seem to see on the media, the conflict between different social kind of groups in Europe is causing tremendous upswing in tension, the inability for the social order at the highest levels to even hold, so that our communities and our own self can deal with, the swirling intensity around us. And in the resurgence of political violence and of horrible thoughts about, when violence does occur from different sides. How do you see this? Is there definitely a resurgence, do you think? How bad is it really in Europe? And what is it that we're facing that we might, from a place of, the presence of Christ in our hearts, actually, stand for a different way of being that might, in some small ways, be effective?
Yeah, good question. I don't know how to measure violence compared to the past. It depends on what measurements you use. There's a few different things going on. I think, firstly, the technological system we have allows us to commit, as you say, violence without even having to engage in it. We can send a drone out to another country and just have them kill somebody, and no, that's just some guy in an office pressing a button. He doesn't even have to fly the plane anymore. I mean, it was bad enough when you could drop a bomb from a height rather than having to send soldiers. Now you don't even have to do that. You press a button on the screen, it's like playing a video game. So in that sense, there's a level of violence that's been removed from our own personal experience. The breakdown of the social order is quite real. It's definitely happening in Europe. I think it's also exaggerated by the media. Basically never believe anything you read in the media. My mum told me she didn't want me to come to America because she heard that the president was sending troops out onto the streets to kill everyone. And I said, I'm pretty sure that's not what's happening. I'm unlikely to get rounded up. You're gonna find that media agendas are going to exaggerate certain things in certain ways, but the social order is clearly breaking down in a lot of ways. Large-scale migration is part of that, technology is part of that, and just a general sense that we don't have anything that holds us together in terms of culture or faith anymore. And that, again, is a bit of a manifestation of the machine society, because we move around everywhere, we're defined by our technology, we go where the money is. I don't know whether that is worse than it's ever been. When I think about these things, I try and think about what it would have been like living as an early Christian in the Roman Empire, which is pretty much the ultimate machine society. I mean, the torture and the barbarity, as we see obviously with Christ, is pretty monstrous. And the Christian faith did overcome that. The world, in a Christian sense, is always a violent and destructive place, and it's always been a violent and destructive place. And in some ways today we're very comfortable. In other places, in other senses, there's more violence than ever. But probably the answer, if you're a Christian, is always the same, which is to try and be a Christian and actually try and follow Christ and not get caught up, as I said earlier, in the kind of idol worship of getting your passions wound up by these things to such a degree that you then want to go out and kill somebody who isn't like you. I think that Christians are quite good, or are supposed to be quite good, because we're trained to be good at living through a collapsing social order. Because that's happened dozens of times. I mean, Byzantium collapsed, Rome collapsed, Israel collapsed. Look what happened to Russia. Look at the martyrs of Romania. I mean, this is what happens. It happens all the time. And often when it happens, Christians and not just Christians get brutally persecuted. And so the teaching is there. You know how to do it. The question is whether we actually can.
I
That's the personal challenge.
I have a much easier time dealing with violence towards myself, as opposed to watching someone I know or even someone I don't know being the victim of horrendous violence. There's the dilemma that I don't know how to act.
That's the question, isn't it?
Oh, Paul, I find you much the same, pre-Christian, Christian. You know, I know you've changed quite a bit, but you know, it's same man. And I'm one of those people that was baptized as an adult. You know, the Catholic, as you know, but I think you know, the two things. The smartphone. I'm no longer on social media. I haven't been in a few years. But what are the main benefits and detriments to switching to something like a flip phone again? I can't remember what they are, and you live in it, you know. And I think I could make that move, you know, and that I want to. And the other thing is, Nick was talking earlier about let's burn it all down. That people have approached him in a violent language, so to speak, and that they and it didn't seem very Christian to him. And I recently found out that current administration, the president is considered by fundamentalist Christians to be a Cyrus figure, and I'd never heard that before until last week. And of course, Cyrus apparently tore a lot of stuff down, and some good came out of it. So that was okay with them, the fundamentalist Christians. And I can't find. I can parse someone, you know, actions and into categories. I don't have a hard time with that, and I don't have a hard time with separating myself from someone with actions that are, as Hillary said, deplorable. But the idea that it's all to the good, I can't reconcile it, and I don't know what action or how to be around someone like that.
Well, that's a question, isn't it? Yeah, well, look, two things then. So there's a smartphone question. I mean, depends what you want to do on your phone. If you're not on social media and you don't want to be on WhatsApp all day or whatever, then you just want to phone someone and text them, then you're okay. Then you don't need anything else. It just depends what you want to do and what you're prepared to not do as well, actually. And, you know, it's if you've become inured to something, which we all do, we just get used to whatever we're doing. Giving it up can be a bit of a wrench, but it can also be liberating. I was speaking to someone yesterday, actually, who said he hadn't read the news for years, and he said he gave up reading the news because he realized it was just making him angry and stressed all the time and he could do nothing. And he said the first 6 months were terrible because it was like cold turkey. It was like he'd just given up booze or whatever. But then he said after that, it was completely liberating, and he has no interest in reading it at all now. And if anything important happens, he'll find out. I've actually stopped reading the news very recently as well, which is a very good way to stay sane. If something really important happens, your neighbour's going to tell you. I really strongly recommend that. But yeah, in terms of the second question, I don't really know how to answer that. I mean, it's such a turbulent time, politically and culturally everywhere, in America and Britain. And everyone's passions are being wound up to such a degree that it's almost impossible for them to think straight. And that, again, is something that would not have happened. We would not have a culture war like this if we didn't have social media and smartphones. That doesn't mean the issues wouldn't be there. That doesn't mean there wouldn't be things to fight about. But there wouldn't be anything like this level of insane hatred and passions wound up to such a degree, and defining whole groups of people as your enemies and being able to instantly insult them with your smartphone. It's like almost a little technology of war. I don't know what to say about fundamentalist Christian predictions. My publisher told me that on the day my book was published last week, apparently some groups of fundamentalists in this country believed that was the day that the world was going to end. And I was disappointed because I did all this work. But turned out they were wrong. Well, who'd have thought it? Who'd have thought it? So I don't know what to say about that. I just think it's sometimes, in terms of being around people, that's the big question, because, you know, I lived through Brexit in the UK, and there are people who don't like to talk to me anymore. And sometimes you just have to sort of withdraw from some people that you can't be around if that's the way that they're doing things. It's just with love, but you just have to. And I think maybe it's just a time where we just get more and more challenged to see how we can measure up to the things we're supposed to be doing. So much of the Christian spiritual practice is about controlling your passions, watching your mind, nepsis. How hard is that with a smartphone coming at you all day long? It makes it impossible. I don't know how any of the Desert Fathers could have become saints with these things in their pockets, because it's like a machine for probing your passions and setting fire to them all day long. So I suppose you look at it in that sense and decide how much of it you can stand. Yeah.
Good afternoon, Paul. It's great to have you at the seminary and monastery with us. I wanted to ask you about a lot of the transhumanist figures you mentioned, like Peter Thiel, seem to have taken an interest financially, not in so-called progressive politics here in this country, but rather in so-called conservative politics. I'm curious what your thoughts are on this interest by a lot of transhumanists in American right-wing politics and what that might do to shape our political dialectic going forward.
It's very interesting, isn't it? It's hard to know how much of this is just kind of everyone jumping on the vibe shift. Like Mark Zuckerberg going from being a progressive to a conservative in about 2 days when Trump is elected, because he can see which way the wind is blowing. And how much of it is like people like Musk, some sort of genuine thing. I wouldn't call it conservative, though. I mean, there's that's a loaded word. Conservatives want to conserve things. I don't think Elon Musk wants to conserve anything, and I don't think Peter Thiel does. I mean, in the literal sense of the word, they are progressives, with not in the left-right sense, but they believe in progress, technological progress. Musk wants to live on Mars and put a chip in his brain. Peter Thiel wants to upload your mind. These are not conservatives, right? They're not wanting to conserve the best of tradition and live in a kind of Wendell Berry-esque Roger Scrutiny fashion. These are radicals. And they happen to be right-wing radicals rather than left-wing radicals, if that even means anything at the moment. It is really interesting. It's almost like sometimes I wonder if this is a kind of bait and switch. Like the right says, hey, wouldn't it be great to go back to when everything was nice and simple and it was lovely? Oh, by the way, we're transhumanists. Right? There's this weird spot. You didn't spot that till after we got elected, but I forgot to tell you, we're rushing ahead with AI and transhumanism, and so you can't make America great again because there's no going back to anything. But it's happening everywhere, actually. I mean, it's happening in Britain as well. There's this kind of alliance of the right with the transhumanists, but that can only be the case because the right aren't actually conservative. The so-called right and the so-called left are both progressives in the sense that they want to move forward along this line of so-called progress, away from anything traditional, away from anything rooted, away from anything natural, away from anything religious, and towards this grand vision of progress, money, growth, and technology. Technology is the tool by which all of that happens. So it is really interesting to see that kind of right-wing techno capital stuff going on, and I think in some ways it's going to be the political future for a while. I think progressivism is kind of a busted flush. Everyone's sick of the left. They're sick of being scolded by woke people. So, why not have an alliance of capitalism, the political right, and transhumanism? That seems to be where we're going, and it doesn't look very good. So, I don't know, put not your trust in princes, I would say. Left-wing or right-wing princes, they're all going to let you down in the end. So, but it's very interesting. Watching where it goes for the next 5 years is going to be really interesting.
Wanted to thank you for coming out. And you mentioned earlier that this new AI trend has been kind of big business for countries, whether they're left-leaning or right-wing. And with that comes a lot of money. And I wanted to ask you, to what extent do you think these people creating these AIs gain from trying to manipulate us into thinking that it's more advanced than it is? And I'll just give a small example where there was dozens of articles floating around that an AI changed its own code to prevent itself from being shut down. And I was interested in this, so I did research, and the truth of it is the AI had a glitch. It had a bug. It's sort of like you pressed the power button on your phone and it didn't work. But they drummed it up saying like, oh, well, no, that was the AI changing its code. So do you think that there's also a lot of that going on where they want us to think it's so advanced and they want us, therefore, to put so much trust in it?
Well, I asked that exact question to this guy from Silicon Valley I was talking to yesterday, actually, because I've been wondering this for a while. My best guess is at the moment there are two separate things going on, but they're related. And the first one is an AI bubble, which is definitely being talked up in the same way that the housing bubble was. Because at the moment, every venture capitalist in the world is putting their money in AI. Everyone's just putting AI on everything, even though they don't know why. I have a friend who's a university professor, and he said the department said to him, right, you have to start finding a way to use AI in your research, because we just need everyone to do that. And he said, but I don't need to. Why? And they said, well, we just need everyone to do that. We've got a grant. Right? So there's a bubble. There's clearly a bubble going on. There's going to be a lot of investment in really rubbish AI tech, which will probably then collapse. Because AI is such a general term that people are just using it for anything and it looks cool. And so it wouldn't surprise me to see lots of things that are currently being pushed just collapsing in the same way that the dot-com bubble burst. But at the same time, the quest to create superhuman intelligence has been going on since the 1950s. And if you actually look at the progress of it, it tends to go up and then down and up and down, but it keeps going upwards. So these supposedly intelligent systems can do things they couldn't do 10 years ago and do things they couldn't do 20 years ago. I would expect that to continue because the people who are really pushing that have a huge amount of money and a huge amount of power. I think both of those things can be true at once. I think the quest to create this giant mind and the singularity and the rest of it is going to keep going. But in the short term, there'll probably be lots of terrible little companies that will collapse away. But the bigger, I would love it if the whole thing was a bubble, but I don't think it is. I hope to be wrong.
I rediscovered you when the machine was at my doorstep with vaccine mandates. So thank you for walking me through that insanity. And I'm curious, now that the UK has digital ID on their doorstep, if you have new thoughts on how people can resist immediately when the machine is at your doorstep.
It's very hard, isn't it? Where I lived in Ireland during the pandemic, we had vaccine passports. And I didn't have one, neither did my family, so we couldn't go anywhere for 6 months. And they did start talking about vaccine mandates, and I was seriously wondering whether I had to move back to Britain, but they dropped it in the end. It was actually very interesting in Ireland because we had this whole system of very, very stringent lockdowns and mask mandates and vaccine passports, and the whole thing was set up. And then one day, the end of the pandemic, apparently, just suddenly ended, the Prime Minister stood up and he gave a television press conference and he said, okay, the science now says that we don't need to do any of these things anymore. And literally, an hour later, they all disappeared. So I don't know how you go from everyone's going to die if you go out without a mask on to everything's fine now, but they did. And when I was writing about that, I was trying to think about exactly that question. What happens when these things come at you? I don't know whether the UK will get the digital ID system or not, but it's certainly likely to come down the line. Because it's the logic of where we are socially as well, because of the main reason they're trying to introduce that is that they can't control immigration, so they think this will help them to do it. I suspect that it won't. And I also suspect that the other reason to have it is that they just have everybody monitored and tied in. So the system that's going to come about in the UK is that everyone will need a digital ID. They will have to have a smartphone to have their digital ID, so therefore you can't exist as a British person without a smartphone, and that will be used for pretty much everything. And that's always presented as a choice, but of course it's not a choice. It will creep very fast. So I don't know exactly what to say about that, but it's one of those moments where you have to say, if you are British, I am, but I don't live in Britain, you wouldn't be able to live in that country without that thing. Right? You would not be able to actually function as a British citizen. So you don't have much choice unless you want to emigrate, right? Which most people can't do. It's that kind of third level question I was talking about just now, like the big structure of the culture. The only thing you could do with that is campaign against it. But I also think that the logic of a society which is basically crumbling in lots of ways, economically and culturally and socially, is always going to be towards more control from the center, because that's the only way the state can keep control of things. Can only manage the borders if everyone's monitored and controlled. It can only manage the workforce in that way. And COVID was a dry run for that, because we realized that if you just do all this stuff through everybody's smartphones, then you've got them under control, especially if you can scare them. So I don't really know how to answer the question. I don't know what I would do if I lived in Britain at the moment, actually. It's very hard, yeah. But it's that question of lines and where you draw them. Yes, it is a proposal, and it hasn't been voted on, and the opposition is opposed to it. So, with any luck, not that they have much of a majority, but all the opposition parties are opposed to it. So that doesn't mean it will happen. but it's certainly on the cards.
Hello, Paul. You were an environmental activist, I guess, for many years. And you probably know that the machine has gotten its claws deep into the environmental movement, where we're seeing now even the air is becoming commoditized as carbon dioxide and counted and economized. And so for somebody like you and like me, I also share kind of a love of creation and want to protect the beauty in it. That's not the way to do it in the machine way. But beyond kind of putting away our smartphones and simplifying our own lives so that we can pray better, how do you continue to be a sort of an activist that protects the beauty in creation without participating in the machine version of that protection?
Yeah, I have a whole chapter in the book about machine environmentalism, actually, because I agree with you that it's just become radically commodified. What happened to the green movement is that it started off maybe in the 1970s as a movement which was calling for a kind of back to the land, radical simplicity approach, which worked for some people, but was probably never going to change the whole of society. And when people realized that wasn't going to work, they effectively, over a fairly long period, got pretty much co-opted by a technological argument that the only way you can save the planet is to effectively operate within this technological system. And there's a logic to it. You say, well, we need to stop the climate changing, so we need to stop these emissions, so we need to measure them, and then we need to do this instead, and we need to put up a certain number of wind farms. But that's gone very, very quickly into an argument into it. For example, one thing that I talk about in the book in some detail is the notion of vat-grown food, which will replace actual farmed food. The likes of George Monbiot are arguing that we should abolish all farming so that we can grow food in vats and eat that, and it'll taste just as good as the real thing. And you end up in a machine which supposedly exists to protect nature, but actually, again, exists to replace it. So I think the answer to the question is I wouldn't consider myself an activist anymore. Maybe I still am, but I think there's a difference between being active and being an activist. I think if you're an activist, you usually have, firstly, a big political involvement, and also you have perhaps an ideology or a grand theory that you're trying to impose, whereas you can still be active on a fairly local level in terms of growing your own food, taking your children into the forest, you certainly can stand against certain developments that are destructive. But again, it's the same old question. How do we draw lines when machine society is commodifying and turning everything into technology? So much of this is about stories. What story are we telling about the machine and technology, but also what stories are we telling about nature and our relationship to nature and our relationship to creation? If you're a materialist, and most of our society is, then creation or nature, whatever you want to call it, is just a collection of stuff. And you measure it by measuring carbon emissions or biodiversity, and it's a good idea to protect it. But it's not a collection of stuff. It's the creation of God, and God's spirit is through it and can be experienced in it. And it's full of other living beings, which we're supposed to tend and keep. And so telling a different story about nature, one that gives us an actual human relationship to it rather than a technological or materialist one, makes a difference. It sounds a bit nebulous, but the way you talk about these things and the way you think about them as well as the way you relate to them can matter. So there's still a strong case for protecting and conserving and standing against the technological destruction of nature, but also going back to a much older way of seeing it and rejecting this kind of technological. Look at the language that's used. Look at the way people talk about carbon and biodiversity. These are all machine words. What's biodiversity? What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. You're talking about the abundance of beings in a forest. You're not talking about the diversity of biology. I mean, it's a technological way of seeing. So if we could talk differently, then that's a start. But there's also a necessity to stand up against the most destructive things that are still happening.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We're going to stand up and pray to finish up, but before we do that, just as a reminder, I see some of you came with your own books to get Paul's signature. Please go ahead and come up. Some of you immediately went to the back and started picking books up. You actually have to purchase them. They're not free. So come to me. I have a very machine way of getting you to pay for them, so apologies in advance.
Христо блаженною і пренепорочною, і Славничую без сравнения серафим, без истения Бога Слова рушую, сушую Богородицу Тя величаю.